So let us start with our prayer, bringing our hands together in our heart, gazing at the spiritual eye. Let us pray. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Mahavtar Babaji, Bhagwan Krishna, Lahiri Mahashay, Swami Sri Yukteswarji, beloved Gurudev Paramhans Yoganandaji, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyanandaji, saints and sages of all religion, humbly we bow to you, O great ones. We are here to learn the subtle teachings of yoga, to understand and practice them in our lives. Be with us, help us steady our mind, help us open our heart, help us attune our consciousness to thy super consciousness so that we could receive these teachings and practice them in our lives incessantly and without attachment. Om. Let us start with chant and then we'll take this further in our class. Let us take a moment to hold the vibration of this chant, holding our heart, our mind on the lotus feet of Divine Mother, blue lotus feet of Divine Mother, ever enchanting, ever graceful. Good afternoon once again, everyone. I'm sorry, I think there might be some background noises because there's some Ganesh Chaturthi celebration going on outside. I hope we'll sail through with the grace of our gurus. So, as we all know, this is our fifth class, and as we again know that in today's class we are going to go deeper into the practices for controlling the vrittis of the mind, right? So now, by now, what we have gone through is what is the definition of yoga? What does one who is established in yoga, what does that bring, right? And when we are not established in yoga, then what happens, right? And then Patanjali has now also helped us understand what are the different vrittis, right? And we looked at the five kinds of vrittis and their two forms or two natures of being afflictive or non-afflictive, right? Like klishta and aklishta. Now, in today's class, we're going to look at the verse 12 to 16, right? And in these set of five verses, what Patanjali is helping us understand is what is the core structure of any spiritual path, right? Now, on the surface of it, like almost all of the sutras, these sutras also look pretty simple, pretty innocuous, very benign, or very simple, right? But when we really pay attention to them, they are so profound in a way that what it does is it really brings everything together in just uh, two of these fundamental building blocks of any practice, right? And obviously, we'll go into these two aspects of any sadhana, any spiritual practice. But so what Patanjali does is not only brings out in a way like a meta sort of structure of our spiritual path, but then also very clearly defines what are these two, how do we really differentiate between them, and then it Patanjali helps us understand whatever we are doing in our sadhana, right? Whatever spiritual path we are on, it could be we are obviously on a path of Kriya Yoga, but it could be a path of Karma Yoga, it could be a path of Bhakti Yoga or Jnana Yoga. Any path that we are on will always have this meta structure, right? And that is what Patanjali is helping us understand, and then helping us in a way remember to follow these, or to make sure that we are balancing both of them in our sadhana, right? Because it's possible to sway too much in one direction, which ultimately again imbalances the entire spiritual path, right? So Patanjali defines them and then helps us understand the specific in a way the specific structure of these two on any spiritual path that we are following, right? So we'll go through the verses first. What we'll do is just like in the last class, first round we'll go through the verses through the Sanskrit and the English translation as given by Swami Kriyananda ji, and then we'll try and understand the holistic meaning of all of these verses, because in a way all of these verses are closely tied together, and they're talking about the same thing, right? So the 12th verse is where Patanjali is talking about what are these two things which lead to the nirodha of the vrittis, right? So Patanjali says in the 12th verse, Patanjali says, Abhyasa Vairagya Tan Nirodha, right? And the way Swamiji translate it is the vrittis are calmed by practice and non-attachment, right? So we'll just pay attention to the words as always. What are the words which Patanjali is using? Where Patanjali is really pointing us to, right? So Patanjali is saying abhyas, vairagya, right? So in this verse itself, in a way, Patanjali is describing the whole structure of any spiritual path, which is built on these two foundations, right? Which is abhyasa and vairagya, right? We'll come to the definition of these. In fact, in the subsequent verses, Patanjali himself is going to clearly articulate the definition of these and what can be really looked at, or any sadhana can be looked at from a particular lens to understand where does it classify between these two sort of separations or aspects or sort of parts of any spiritual practice, right? So one side we have abhyasa, the other side we have vairagya, and then Patanjali says tannirodha. So Patanjali is saying that which helps us in nirodha, or which means, as we are knowing, as we have been discussing, which is a act of controlling or restraining, right? All the vrittis in our consciousness, in our chitta, right? Which is in our heart. So the process of nirodha of these vrittis consists of abhyasa and vairagya, right? Now let us look at these two words, abhyasa and vairagya, right? Abhyasa, when we simply translate it, as Swamiji also does, it means practice, right? Now practice could be of anything, right? And that's why in the next verse, Patanjali will define what specific practice we are talking about, right? So on one side, we have practice, right, which is abhyasa. And abhyasa also has a certain sort of connotation to it, which is about perfecting the art, right? So it's like we do abhyasa until we have achieved mastery, right? So for all of us who are on a spiritual path, we are practicing, we are doing abhyasa so that we can perfect that, right? So in a way, it's like all the warm-ups, right? All the small, long sessions that we are doing, which are like warm-ups before we really go into the real battle, right? But as we look at it, in our entire life itself is that battle. And every moment on this life, in this battlefield, is an opportunity to practice, right? Is an opportunity to do this abhyasa, right? Which is wonderful, right? Because in a way, Patanjali is also saying that the journey itself is also in a way the goal, right? Which means that while we are doing abhyasa, abhyasa itself is perfecting, and in that we will, in that abhyasa, consistent, continuous, uninterrupted practice itself, we lead us to self mastery. And it's not like a final exam. Obviously there is an exam, we can talk about it, but it's not like there is one final exam where once we have done our practice, we just have to in a way just vomit out everything, right? Just like our regular exam. So it's not like that regular exam where there's practice and then there is an exam. It's like every moment we are living, we are just practicing, right? We are practicing, we are perfecting the art of what Patanjali is going to help us understand next. But in a way, we are perfecting this practice. We are perfecting our sadhana. We are perfecting our skill, right? And when it comes to Vairagya, again, Patanjali will describe, define, as always, the word perfectly. But Vairagya, the word itself means which is devoid of raga, right? Vairagya means devoid of raga, and raga generally means attraction, right? Attraction. But we know rag has again this connotation of this attraction of the heart, right? And that is what we are really trying to curb, right? In a way, it's the natural flow or movement of the heart towards objects. And that is what is really cause of all of these vrittis, right? So these desires which pull our heart in certain directions, which sort of create rag and dvesha. So rag and dvesha always go hand in hand. Rag means in a way attraction or craving, and dvesh means in a way repulsion, right? Or shoving away, right? So it's attraction and repulsion, which always goes hand in hand. So while Patanjali is not talking about dvesha as directly, but because those are the two sides of the same coin. So essentially, we can understand whenever there's a rag or dvesh in our heart, we are moving away from the state of vairagya. And when we are able to control or restrain that natural or that desirous movement of the heart, which leads to vrittis, that is vairagya, right? Let us go further. So this is what is the two practices Patanjali is going to talk about now in the subsequent verses, which is abhyasa and vairagya. And what it does is Patanjali says it helps us control or restrain the vrittis in our consciousness, in our heart, right? So this is verse 12. In verse 13, then Patanjali says, Tatra sthito yatno abhyasa, right? So now, once again, Patanjali is very clearly defining what is abhyas, right? Now, abhyas, as we discussed, could be of anything. When we are practicing for an exam, even that is an abhyas. When we are practicing for, say, learning something like a musical instrument, right? Even that is an abhyas, right? When we are, say, suppose, going when we go in a corporate environment, and there's a particular skill that we need to learn, right? A tool or a technology, etc., that we need to learn. We practice on that until we really become comfortable with it. Even that is an abhyas, right? But Patanjali is talking about a particular abhyas, right? That abhyas which is going to help us control or restrain our vrittis, right? That has to be a particular abhyas, and that's why Patanjali says tatra sthito yatno abhyasa. So tatra means that, sthito means that which leads to stability, right? That which leads to stillness, that which leads to equanimity, right? That yatna, right? Yatna means any effort, right? Any effort or any, in a way, uh, perseverance that we do, right? Yatna means something for which we are doing continuous or constant effort that we have to put, right? So that's a yatna. So that yatna, which leads to the stability of our mind, of our consciousness, right? That is called abhyas, right? So when we look at it, even on our path, whenever we're doing a practice like Hong Song, right? Whenever we are doing a practice like Om technique, right? Whenever we are doing, in fact, kriya, right? What all of them are helping us do is to bring that the state of sthita of mind, right? That stability of our mind, that concentration by which we can control or focus our mind on one object, right? And by that practice, what happens, our mind is naturally stabilized, right? And that's why this word sthita also has a very sort of particular connotation, right? So what sthita also means, it is not only a stability which is achieved in certain times, right? So when we are doing meditation, obviously we feel this peace, right? We feel a more stable mind, we feel more centered in ourselves, right? But as we go out in the world, again our mind gets distracted, our mind gets in a way affected by the outside turmoil, by the outside humdrums, etc., which leads to instability of the mind, right? But what Patanjali is trying to say is when we practice this over and over, what it does, it brings in not only this state, not only this stability, but a continuous state where the mind is stable, right? So that is what Patanjali is helping us look at, which is a state where, irrespective of what the outward circumstances, irrespective of what is happening outside our minds, right? Our outs in an outside surrounding. In fact, even in our minds, right? There is a stability which we can hold on to, right? And once we have hold on to that stability, our mind becomes fixed. Our mind becomes stable. Our mind draws then that peace and that wisdom, which helps us sort of in a way expand into that wisdom, right? That wisdom, which again naturally develops that state of vairagya, right? That state of non-attachment, right? Or sometimes it's also translated as dispassion, right? So not becoming involved, not becoming engrossed into something, right? That state of being equanimous, right? Irrespective of the outward situation, happens by or comes about by the stability of the mind, right? And that is where we see both of these, abhyas and vairagya, go hand in hand, right? Our abhyas gives us that wisdom, that stability of the mind, which develops vairagya, right? And when we have a vairagya developing, that vairagya helps us take our mind away from these objects of craving, these objects of aversion, these objects of desire. And then that brings the sthita, that brings the stability of the mind, which helps us sort of build this even deeper wisdom, right? And that leads to vairagya, right? So that is how both of them are going hand in hand. So this was the 13th verse where Patanjali was describing what constitutes a abhyasa, which is a practice, or any practice for that matter. Here Patanjali is not being specific, right? In fact, that is the beauty of this, that it is more like it's like a principle, and that's why it's called sutras, right? Because sutras are like threads, right? It's a thread on which you can which can be used to create any kind of garland or a necklace. You can use flowers, you can use beads, you can use anything, right, to create beautiful flowers out of that thread, right? So thread is that fundamental principle that binds together any particular form, right? So for any form, any garland to have that particular form or shape or nature, it's need to be built on a certain foundation. And that is what Patanjali is helping us or giving us, right? So Patanjali is giving us those sutras, those definitions, those formulas, basis which we can develop any practice, right? And we can, if we are on a path, we can clarify and we can stabilize, we can perfect our practice, right? And that is why Patanjali is now defining each of these two sort of two parts to our practice, right? Or two parts to our spiritual path, which helps us control the vrittis. And sthita is the outcome of that practice, of that abhyasa. Now, moving on the 14th verse, Patanjali is now going to help us understand what is the nature of that practice, right? He already talked about what that practice brings, right? What is the outcome, which is stability of mind, stability of wisdom, equanimity, right? And now Patanjali is saying what is the nature of that practice. And so Patanjali says, Satu dirgha kale nairantarye asevita dridha bhumihi, right? Again, many words, right? But when we look at the English translation, Swamiji says, spiritual practice becomes firmly grounded, dridha bhumi, right? When we have a firm grounding of our spiritual practices, when those are taken for a long time, dirgha kale means long duration, long time, without break, nairantarye, which means without interruption, without break, and with deep earnestness, where Patanjali is saying satkara. Satkara, again, as we generally would be using this word in our Hindi, Sanskrit, or a regional language, where we use satkar as a form of reverence, as a form of earnest devotion, right? So Patanjali is saying there are three components, or there are three aspects to this practice. One is it has to be dirghakale, that is, it has to be continuous, right? For long term, sorry, it is Dirghakali means for a long time, right? Long, sustained, in a way, sustained and long practice, Dirghakale. Then Patanjali is saying, uh, Nairantarya, which means continuous, right? That is, it is not, or it does not have interruptions. It has to be continuous, right? And then Patanjali is saying Satkara, with reverence, with devotion, with earnestness. So Patanjali is saying if we have these three things, then they will help us build a firm grounding of that practice, which will lead to the stability of the mind we want, right? So that again is a very practical and a very important, in fact, one of the sole criterias of any sadhana, right? So when we come to sadhana, there's a subtle difference when we talk about abhyasa and sadhana, right? Abhyasa has a general nature of that practice, right? That has general nature. When we talk about sadhana, there's a specific sadhana that we do, right? So for Kriyavas, there's a specific set of sadhana that we'll be doing, right? For a bhakti yogi, there'll be a specific set of sadhana that a bhakti yogi or yogin would be doing, right? That is part of a sadhana, right? But these three attributes are necessary to develop any sadhana into a firm grounding, right? And these three things are, it has to be long term, it has to be continuous, and it has to be without interruptions, and it has to be with reverence, right? With devotion. And once we have all of these three, and then we are doing them continuously, they create that solid foundation. The Dhrida Bhumi of our practice is built on the foundation of these three aspects, right? And that is why when we look at it, even in our sadhana, right? We have a tremendous amount of emphasis on doing our practice daily, right? Doing our practice twice daily, right? Why? Because every day there is a sort of a deluge of Maya. There's a sort of a onslaught of Maya, of our desires, of our likes and dislikes on our consciousness, on our being, right? And if we don't reinforce our practices, if we don't reinforce our spiritual magnetism, it's very easy to lose that power, to lose that magnetism, which a continuous practice develops, right? And that is where it is so essential to build our foundation of our practice on this continuous, uninterrupted practice, right? And when we look at these words, they are relevant at different time scales, at different contexts, right? So if even in a session, when we are sitting for a session, right? When we talk about one particular meditation session, while when we start small, right? We'll say, okay, let's start with something like 5 minutes or 10 minutes of meditation, right? But when then we also keep on encouraging, emphasizing, supporting, helping to increase that duration, right? So even in one sitting, we would want to sit longer, right? Because as we sit longer, we get more and more control over our body, our mind, our energy. So all these, when we sit longer, we develop a firmer, a more grounded control, which is not possible in a shorter duration session, right? That's why we see all of these yogis would go into these isolated, secluded places so that they can have that long and uninterrupted practice, right? So first thing is, even in the context of a sitting meditation, it has to be continuous, long and continuous, right? Which means that even if, say, suppose we are sitting for 1 hour, right? But if we are constantly interrupting that practice, right? We are fidgeting, we are looking at our mobile, we're looking at the clock, we're looking at something or the other, right? We are interrupting. So if we're interrupting the practice, that is not going to give us build that or help us build that strong foundation on which our we can build a stable mind, right? An equanimous mind. That is why even a short meditation is better. As Swamiji used to say, that even a shorter meditation, but a meditation where you have really put your 100%, where after the meditation, and we love that meditation, is better than doing a longer meditation where we were distracted most of that time. That practice was interrupted for a lot of time, and we get this resentment out of practicing when our body and our mind is not really favorable to a longer practice, right? So the path generally is, we want to develop a longer practice, but we don't want to develop it through force, which develops resentment, which develops these subconscious habits of being distracted, of being fidgeting all the time, right? So that is where we need to be gradual, we need to be patient with the practice, and we need to do it continuously and gradually increase the practice so that we are enjoying whatever practicing we are doing, and that enjoyment itself brings our mind back again to the practice and helps us stabilize the mind in the practice, right? In fact, that is why when we look at it, Master or Swamiji will always say that when we are doing any kind of, when we are on a spiritual path, when we are on a path which is, we understand is not going to be a very simple affair, right? It's not like I started this practice today and the next maybe 1 week or 2 week or 6 months is going to get over, right? It's a long process. Why it's a long process? Because throughout these eons, throughout these millions of incarnations, we have developed, we have cherished, we have in a way held so much of vritti, so many desires in our heart that whenever the right time arises, these desires draw our minds, right? And that is what really disturbs our practice. So to really perfect our practice and to really subdue all of these different desires, to really go beyond these desires, to transcend these desires, to in a way flush these desires in the deluge of that energy, right, which Kriya brings, requires time, right? Requires sustained effort and requires uninterrupted effort, right? So in a sitting, it has to be long, it has to be continuous. But at the same time, when we look at it, even a lifetime of practice, even that a lifetime of practice has to be, while obviously there will be ups and downs in the practice, the the life itself has to be a life of continuous uninterrupted practice, right? If that practice is not continuous, if that practice is constantly getting interrupted, say we are, and this is quite common, right? When we start on a spiritual practice, we are very enthusiastic, right? We feel it's hardly going to take time. I'll just start, and then within maybe a year, at max 3 years, let's give that much to master, and within 3 years it'll be all well. We'll be in samadhi all 24/7. We will be blissed out. We'll be always in communion with God. We'll have all that beautiful experiences that we heard, that we have talked, that we know these yogis to have, and all that will come, right? But when we go into the path, we realize how difficult it is, right? But the point is, if we are just taking that practice one day at a time, one session at a time, one kriya at a time, then it helps us really develop that satkar, that reverence for the practice, which is needed to really help build that strong foundation, right? And that reverence cannot come from force, right? That reverence comes from the natural heart's love to do these practices. So only when a heart is naturally inclined to, is naturally drawn to these practices, then we will be able to sustain these practices for long term without interruptions, without distraction, right? And that is where, while in the beginning, as Swamiji used to say, that when we start, we would have a lot of a very nice experiences, right? It's like honeymoon period when we start any spiritual sadhana, right? It'll seem like it all seems so easy, right? But that is because there's a lot of magnetism. There's a beginner's luck, as Swamiji would call, right? When we start, because there is not a lot of resistance to that enthusiasm, right? To that hopeful sort of possibility, or sort of that hopeful optimism, right? But when we practice and when we see that maybe not 1 year, maybe not 3 year, maybe longer, when we see people who are having a much deeper, much devout, much stronger practice, and are still on the path for long and still devoted, still sincerely practicing, then it sort of, in a way, it sort of gives us some support, right? But at the same time, it also shakes that initial sort of enthusiasm, that bubbling, unconstrained, unrestrained optimism, right? And that is what sort of, in a way, disturbs or sort of takes the energy out of that beginner's luck, right? But if we can just cultivate that practice with gratitude, with reverence, with realizing that it's not going to be a very short process, it's going to be a long process. But if we just take it minute by minute, hour by hour, kriya by kriya, year by year, all is going to be going to go in the right direction, right? That is why master used to say that when we plant a seed, right, if you just dig that plant and keep checking whether it has sprouted, right, how much the root has grown, it will never grow, right? So we have to put that seed, we have to do the practice, we have to water the plant, we have to mend the plant, we have to carefully watch the weeds growing around the plant, right? And we have to create fence around the plant so that no animals eat that plant, right? Once we are doing all that, we have to with that we have to do all that with the cultivation of the faith, that if we are doing all that, all the necessary transformations are happening, right? They're happening so deep down below that we not always be they're not always be able to recognize them, we're not able to really point it out, right? That what has changed from practice to practice, or day to day, or even year to year, right? But when we really reflect back, we'll see so much has changed in all of our lives, right? From the time we've started coming, from the time we have started practicing, that every sort of, in a way, every time we practice, we are changing, we are evolving, we are improving. Vrittis of our heart are actually reducing, right? And that is the faith that we have to cultivate. And once we have that faith, we trust the process, we trust the techniques, we trust the gurus behind our back, right? Who have done it, who have perfected this art, who have shown by their own perseverance, their own effort, and becoming a master, that it is possible for each one of us. And that really cultivates that, for faith, when we cultivate, really helps us build that strong foundation of a practice, right? And that is when our practice matures into a dirghakale nairantarye satkara asevita kind of a practice, right? So this was the 14th verse, which is describing the nature of abhyas, right? Now in the 15th verse, now Patanjali is going to take the next two verses to describe vairagya, right? Again, the equally important aspect of our practice, which is non-attachment, right? So what Patanjali says is Drashtu Ashravika Vishaya Vitrishnasya Vashikara Sangya Vairagyam. Right? Again, a lot of complicated words, but when we look closely at each of these words, a very clear description of what Patanjali means by Vairagyam. Right? So Patanjali is saying Drashtu or Ashravinakam. Right? Drashtu means something which we have seen, right? Something which we have seen with our physical eyes or in our thoughts, in our mind, right? Or ashravika, which means what we have heard, right? So things which we have either seen or heard, right? Which are vishaya, which are objects of our desires, which we have seen or heard about. And then there is a natural trishna, right? Trishna is a very, again, a word which describes a particular kind of liking, right? It's a very unique, in a way, Trishna means also thirst, right? So say, suppose, imagine you are on a deserted desert, or a remote island, right? And there is no water, right? And you're surrounded by sea, but you can't drink the sea water, right? Imagine the thirst you have for water, right? So that thirst has a very specific object. It's not like just attraction, right? It's not just infatuation. It's attraction for a very specific object, right? It's the specific object of our desire. In that moment, when we're really thirsty to the extent of dehydration, water is the most important thing in our life, right? And imagine the kind of trishna that brings, right? It brings me to a very poignant incident which happened. And there are different versions of the story, but it is said that there was once a devotee which comes to a sage, right? And this particular person was really curious, was really enthusiastic, and wanted quick progress, right? So he asks his master, his the sage, that how can I really progress fast, right? And the sage was walking near the river, right? And there are various versions of the story, but imagine the sage and the master and the disciple are walking near the river, and the disciple is asking, Master, how do I make quick progress? How do I make steady and quick progress so that I don't have to belabor, I don't have to persevere so long, and I just make that quick progress to this realization, to self-realization, God realization, etc. Right? And so master looks at the student and brings him nearer in the water, right? And then he brings him closer, and then he holds his neck and then pushes him inside the water, right? And then he keeps him shoved inside the water, and the devotee is really grasping for breath. He's like he's doing, Master, he's shouting, but he can't really shout. He's grasping for breath. He's almost on the verge of dying, right? And then the master really takes the man out of the water, right? And then he says, in that moment, right, when you were really uh, the only thing which you wanted in that moment was that breath, right? To take that last gasp of breath, right? Imagine that trishna, that sort of intensity of your desire. If you could only cultivate that intensity of desire, your progress will be quick, you will be fast, right? So in a way, that is what Patanjali is talking about, that there's a particular trishna, there's a particular desire of the heart, which is towards these different objects, right? And when we are able to control that, control our natural movement of our heart, of our mind towards that object, that ability, that control is what is called vairagya, right? And the way Swamiji translates this verse, Swamiji says is, from constant self-remembrance, there comes complete non-attachment to things heard and seen, right? So it goes both ways, right? When we have developed vairagya, it in a way develops the ability to control the mind, to which is naturally drawn towards its objects. And when we do that continuously, when we are able to do that persistently, then that develops vairagya, right? So the in a way, first Patanjali is describing what is that state of vairagya, right? Where, and Patanjali says, when we are able to control, when we are able to control our mind, control our heart from getting in sort of getting bound or getting infatuated or getting in rag towards the object of its desires, then we can define that ability, that mastery as vairagya, right? And that is why the word which Patanjali is using is, Patanjali is saying Vashikara Sangya, right? Vashikara means control, right? And Sangya means the definition or the name of it, right? So Patanjali is saying, when we are able to control, and that's why the word Patanjali using is Vishaya, in a way, what Patanjali is saying, Vishaya with Trishnasya. With, so Trishna and with Trishna. With Trishna means it's a common sort of a rule in Sanskrit, that whenever we apply V as a prefix to a word, it sort of inverts the meaning, right? So Trishna means the desire, right? That craving. V Trishna means the control of that craving, right? Being able to control, being able to, being not getting attracted, right? To what? To the Vishayas, to the objects of our senses, to the objects of our desires, which pull our heart, right? And where do they come from? They come from things which we have seen, things which we have heard, things which we have experienced, right? So what happens whenever, so what really happens, and we've talked about this, right? Whenever we experience something, and whenever we sort of in a way we like that experience, right? We give energy to that experience. We sort of in a way we create a vritti in our astral spine around that particular thought, around that particular object, right? And that object or that thought has a whirlpool of energy. And whenever there is an associated thought, whenever there is an associated memory, right, then there is a sort of emergence of that energy, which then attracts all the other thoughts which draw us towards that object of desire, right? And that is what is happening. So what Vairagya is helping us do is, whenever our mind is not naturally getting drawn towards that object. It's a way to let go, right? And that is why it's very important to understand the subtle distinction between the word detachment and non-attachment, right? When we say detachment, detachment has a certain kind of a negative connotation or a kind of a suppression, right? So you are trying to say that you become attached to something and then you are trying to detach yourself from it, right? So it's like a force you're pulling, a force you're applying to suppress or take you out of that attachment, right? When we talk about non-attachment, what we are really saying about how can we even sort of allow us to go transcend that attachment, in a way transcend that attachment to even before it sort of gets a firm ground on our mind, on our chitta. So even before that seed is planted in our chitta, how can we just let it go, right? And that is the real power of vairagya. So vairagya is a practice and it's also an outcome, right? So when we develop vairagya, the way to develop vairagya is by letting go, right? So all of these vrittis, all of these desires which are coming in our mind, they sprout, right? They bring a thought or they bring some energy. They might bring a deluge of emotion if there's a lot of energy to that thought, right? But if you just let go, and the easier it is for us to let go, the stronger is our vairagya, right? And the more we are able to do that, that simple act of letting go, the stronger our vairagya develops. And what it does is, the other way to look at vairagya, so vairagya, as we discussed, comes from rag, right? Which is in a way attraction, right? Or craving. But rag also comes from the root word rag, or also comes from rang, right? So rag, rang, all that has this connotation of coloring, right? So what these objects do is that they color our perception, right? And that is again the major problem with our conditioning, with having these vrittis, with these desires, right? Because when an object of our desire comes, we suddenly get infatuated by it because our perception gets colored by it. It's a common sort of phrase that we say love is blind, right? Because when we love something, suddenly it's like there's a screen which comes in front of us and we forget what exactly we're looking at, and we get infatuated by that object, and that colors our perception. What Vairagya does, it sort of uncolors it. Because we let it go, we are not attached to that object. It does not hold a firm grounding in our mind, in our consciousness, in our chitta. And then that's why we are able to live lightly, right? We are able to perceive things as they are. We are able to sort of make right decisions because our wisdom, our buddhi, our vivek is not colored by these desires, by these objects of senses, of perceptions, etc. Right? So that is what Patanjali is saying, that by that constant remembrance, by that, and that's how I'll also come to that practice which Swamiji is pointing about, is that constant self-remembrance, right? Because when we are able to remember ourself, remember our true identity, remember the whole problem is the problem of identity, right? We've forgotten who we are, and our sarupyam, we take our sarupyam to be with the vrittis which are coming, and we want to take that sarupyam back to the drashtu, to the seer, to the self, right? And when we are able to stabilize that, when we are able to stabilize our our perception, when we are able to stabilize our remembrance of that drashtu, we are able to develop that natural vairagya. And that is what Swamiji is talking about in the 15th verse. Now we'll come to the last verse for this session, which is the 16th verse, where Patanjali is saying, Tat param. Tat param means that which is the supreme, right? Tat param purusham khyati. Khyati means remembrance again, and that is where these two verses Swamiji is trying to bring that practice together, which is the self-remembrance. So Patanjali is saying Tat param purush khyatir gune gunair trishna vi, again the word vi trishnashyam. So Patanjali is saying Tatparam Purush Khyatir Gunam Vitrashnashyam, which means by what is the perfection? Now, in this verse, Patanjali is saying, what is the perfection of that Vairagyam, right? That what is the perfection of that act of letting go of that dispassion or that non-attachment. And that is the Purush Khyatim, right? Which is the remembrance of that Purusha. Khyatim again comes from the word Khya, the root word Khya, which means thought, right? Which means remembrance. Khyati, that's why also means somebody which is known, right? So when we talk about that some person has so much khyati because everyone knows about him, right? Everyone remembers him. So that khyati means remembrance of that self. And what self? That Purusha, that seer, that drashtu. So when that self remembrance comes, that gives us the perfection of that vairagyam, right? And what that gives vitrishnayam, which means that gives us being able to sort of being able to uh, be not bound by those objects of desires, not to get into those objects of Trishna, right? So becoming Vitrishnasya, by, of becoming in the state of Vairagyam, becoming uncolored, becoming being in the state of wisdom, right? That is what comes when we are able to remember that self constantly, right? That is what Swamiji was talking about in the earlier verse. When we look at the English translation, Swamiji says, when one ceases to thirst for outward manifestation, having realized the Purusha, one attains supreme non-attachment, right? So that supreme non-attachment comes from being able to realize, being able to constantly remember, in fact, being able to be that Purusha, right? And that is the crux of it, right? Purusha is not an object, right? Just like there's so many other objects of our desires. Purusha is not it's not substitution that instead of that chocolate ice cream, I'm replacing it by Purusha. Purusha is our true identity. So what we are saying is that once we become in love with our true identity, once we become engrossed with our true self, once we become engrossed with that self which is God Himself in the form of Satchidananda, in the form of Paramatma in our heart, then that sort of that resting, that abiding, that settling into the self gives us that supreme state of vairagyam, that gives us that. And the word which Patanjali is again using is it's Patanjali is talking about gunarva Vitrishnayam. Gunarva Vitrishnayam means which gives us control, or which gives the ability to control the craving of the gunas, right? So in a way, Patanjali is saying all the gunas, all the attraction, all the aversion that happens, which is happening because of the gunas, right? We can control that once we have developed, once we are able to realize that Purusha, once we are able to develop our true identity, once we are able to settle in our true identity, and when we are able to abide in that constantly, continuously, then it brings and gives that supreme state of dispassion, supreme state of non-attachment, right? So in a way, when we look at it holistically, what Patanjali is saying is that on one side, we stabilize our mind through practices, through specific sadhanas, Hong Song, Om technique, Kriya Pranayam, all of that. And on the other side, we develop that wisdom, right? How do we develop that? By sitting in silence, by introspection, by swadhyaya, by remembering and being in communion with God, by being in divine qualities. That develops wisdom, which empowers, which clears our mind, which purifies our heart, which brings the chitta shuddhi, right? And that it makes it easier for us to practice even longer, even with more vigor, with more uninterrupted zeal. And that again gives us back the stability of being in our own self, right? And that is where when we are able to stabilize our awareness in the self, we will be able to experience that dispassion where things arise in our mind, where things arise in our chitta, where thoughts, desires can come up, right? Because that's their natural habit, right? That's their natural mechanism. It's like Prakriti, it's their nature. So is their swabhava to come up? Is their swabhava to get activated whenever we are talking about those vishayas, whenever those vishayas are being talked about or being when we are able to see them, they get activated. but the ability to just let go, the ability to control our mind, to withdraw, to take a step back, right? And let that thought move out, move away from our sort of active attention, is the whole process of developing vairagya, right? And that is why Master used to recommend being in the self, right? He would constantly recommend to be in your own center, to be in yourself, to be on the Kutastha Chaitanya, right? Because when we are doing it, what we are doing is we are stabilizing our attention, our identity into that Purusha, into that the real Satchidananda state. And when we are able to do that, things of outward sort of distractions don't hold any power above us, right? And that's why Master would say to Swamiji, right, that when ecstasy comes, when that wisdom comes, all these lower desires go away, right? Because once we have tasted that fresh cheese, when we have tasted the bliss of samadhi, when we have tasted the bliss of being in that self, which is unbounded, which is ever present, which is all knowing, which is ever in ever new joy, there is nothing else we would trade it for, right? And that is why all of these objects of desires lose the sway over our mind, lose the sway over our consciousness, right? And the vrittis normally and naturally dissolve, right? So that is how, by practicing both of these together, abhyas and vairagya, we will be able to practice the entire spiritual path. Thanks a lot. I know there's a
Thank
lot can be
you.
said, but in the interest of time, we'll close this session. Thank you for being here. Just let's
Thank
take
you. Thank
so just being feeling that gratitude, that satkar, that reverence for our gurus to really so clearly these great sages, Sage Patanjali, to really bring out these teachings so clearly and helping us develop that faith, that reverence, that gratitude. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. Bye bye.
Thank you, Shashank. Thank you.